All right, so we'll start with some meditation as usual. And because the idea is always to return to the practice that we covered or started covering in our previous session, we'll revisit the meditation on impermanence and, in particular, uh, death. And that is a type of practice that is used across the different Buddhist traditions. In the Pali tradition, it's known as Maranasati, which means mindfulness of death or mindfulness of mortality. The idea being that, or through contemplating this simple fact of life, we can re adjust our expectations, our view of reality, and our attitude towards, amongst other things, the difficult situations in our life, the pleasant situations in our life, basically everything that can trigger emotions in us and trigger desires, because we want to make sure those desires are wise and are aligned with the vast view of genuine well-being for ourselves and others, and recognizing the impermanence of composite phenomena in general and the impermanence of our own life in particular really helps with that readjustment. So that's the basic idea. And we'll do this practice sort of in a meta way, in that we'll first revisit the three foundational statements related to mindfulness of death or mindfulness of dying. And then after that, we'll contemplate, well, what would it be like for a person to really realize this meditation? How would their mind work? What would their perception of reality be? So, stepping back from the meditation itself and kind of playing with our imagination to perform this meta level of practice. And we'll start with just some relaxation to establish a firm foundation for the practice itself. So, please find a comfortable stationary position. Feel free to keep your camera on if you like sharing your presence with others, or to temporarily turn it off if entering a little retreat bubble feels right in this moment. In either case, the first thing we do is coming back to the body and starting to explore the sensations of the body to make sure that we are genuinely comfortable and relaxed. In particular, we can bring our attention down all the way to the ground, where our body is touching the ground, noticing the sensations there and starting to release the physical tension. First from our feet and toes, then from our legs in general, the area of our pelvic floor, our torso, shoulders, upper arms, forearms, hands, and fingers. And then our face, softening the muscles, releasing the tension, and all the types of movements that are currently not necessary. And then extending our awareness to the entire body, allowing our breath to move naturally, and for a little while observing the movements of the breath, the tactile waves that are rushing through our body back and forth when we breathe in and when we breathe out. Then revisiting our highest aspirations related to mind training in general, to contemplative practice in general, really. Our highest vision for why we're practicing, our highest goal. Establishing that in our mind and orienting this practice towards the fulfillment of this goal. May it contribute to, and this is where we can express or envision this highest goal that we're working with, such as full awakening, which is the general goal in the Mahayana tradition of practice, full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. And then with that, for the actual practice of contemplating death itself, we'll briefly revisit the three foundational ideas related to it. The first idea is that death is inevitable. So bringing that into our awareness and contemplating that against the backdrop of our own lived experience. Is it true? Is it relevant in my case? Does it apply to me? Noticing whether there's any resistance, any doubts. But essentially just recognizing that as a fact that's not good or bad in itself. It is inevitable for all of us. And what's important is what we do with it. The second idea is that the time of death is not certain. We don't know. It might come in 30 years and it might come in 3 minutes. Tomorrow, today, 3 years from now, 30 years from now. For most people, it comes as a surprise. So a really wise way to live is to live as if it could happen any moment, including today. And then the third idea, given that these two first statements are simply facts, the main thing that can help us is the Dharma, which in this case refers to any valid system of eudaimonic practice, any valid system that helps us cultivate genuine, long-lasting well-being through the cultivation of the best qualities of our heart and mind, wisdom, compassion, and so forth. So whichever type of genuine Dharma we apply, that's what can help us make our life truly meaningful, make our dying process truly peaceful, and from a Buddhist point of view, make our future lifetimes truly positive as well. So that's the working hypothesis. And we can see whether we want to integrate that into our view and play with it. Pay some attention to the Dharma as a tool for making all these different aspects of life truly happy and meaningful. And then for the next part of our meditation, stepping back from the three statements, which are sometimes expanded into 9 statements, and contemplating whether someone who has truly integrated these statements would be seeing reality in a different way, whether their attitudes towards life and its joys and sorrows would be different from our habitual one. How would they view reality and how would they live? What would their lifestyle be centered around? How would they feel when minor bad things happen, major bad things happen? How would they treat others, given that every meeting could be the very last one? If these contemplations bring us to a sense of the transitory nature of life, if these contemplations help us recognize the transitory nature of life, we can also make some practical decisions right here and now related to how we want to live each moment and how we want to use our life in terms of maybe potentially cultivating some of those qualities that lie at the root of eudaimonic well-being, including, amongst others, loving kindness, compassion, genuine wisdom, generosity, and so forth. This decision that we can hold with our concentration and breathe life into with each new out-breath is also an attitude that we can bend our awareness energy into. Then releasing all the thoughts, all the ideas, all the images to rest in open clarity for a little while. Then coming back to our body to ground ourselves there, noticing the sensations and the process of breathing. Mentally dedicating the energy of this meditation to our highest aspirations. May it contribute to the realization of our highest goal, our highest vision for what's possible. And then slowly concluding the practice by introducing some movement to our body. First coming back to the space around us, and then transitioning into our shared online space as well. Thank you. And so the reason for why we're doing this practice is that last time we talked about the very first line in a teaching known as parting from the four attachments, which is a mind training system, a Lojong system that plays a very important role in the Sakya tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. But apart from that, um, this very same system has also been integrated into other traditions as well. And because it's so famous and so clear in its presentation of the entire path, it does make sense to start our journey into the fascinating world of Lojong texts by covering something that's so clear and precise. And the very first line in that text said, if you cling to this life, you're not a practitioner. But mind you, this is not just a judgmental statement from um, Manjushri, because this teaching was originally a visionary revelation from the Buddha or Bodhisattva of wisdom, Manjushri, to one of the founding fathers of the Sakya tradition. It's not just a judgmental statement. He's not trying to, say, as we say these days, read us to filth. He is essentially saying, well, you can be a practitioner if you do bend your attitudes into something that is relatively at least free from clinging to this life. It's a possibility. Your mind is capable of that. So how do we do that? That's what's described in the more elaborate presentations of this teaching, where we are invited to do the appropriate types of training. And the main type of training that does help us relinquish the over preoccupation with the concerns of this life, in particular the hedonic concerns of this life, is contemplation of impermanence in general, and in particular, as something that hits us right where it hurts, through the contemplation of our own mortality. And this is where it's always um, people often quote the Buddha himself, who famously said that amongst all the footprints, that of an elephant is the largest. Amongst all the thoughts, the thought of death is supreme, meaning it's a really, really helpful thing to contemplate if we want to make our life meaningful. If we contemplate the very fact that this life will end, uh, regardless of our views on reincarnation and so forth, on rebirth and so forth, if we recognize the fact that this life will end, and then we recognize the fact that before death happens, there's probably quite a few moments left, or at least a few moments left. And so, how do I leave these moments? Uh, what qualities do I bring into these moments? Do I cultivate something that would contribute to genuine well being for myself and others? Or am I just wasting this precious opportunity to make this life meaningful? And these are the types of contemplations that come from a recognized, integrated understanding of the very fact that we are indeed mortal. And in the more elaborate systems of practice, this contemplation of impermanence in general and our own mortality in particular is accompanied by certain other meditations that just help us contextualize that even further. So even in the more elaborate systems, here the practitioners would also recognize the fact that, well, yes, death is impermanent, death is inevitable, and we don't know when is it going to come. But on top of that, from the Buddhist point of view, death, of course, is just a transition. In particular, death can be described, and that's sometimes how certain masters describe it, as a shift in our experience in which none of the things that we currently think of as ours remain as that. So with this body, we now think, oh, it's my body. And then all the stuff we quote unquote own, we think, well, that's my stuff. And then the people we associate ourselves with, we think, well, these are my friends, these are my loved ones, and so forth. So there's this projection of me and mine on all of these different building blocks of experience. Well, death is a thing in which it all shifts. Our awareness from a Buddhist point of view continues to exist. But this coarse personality that we currently identify ourselves with, that dissolves, and all the appearances that we currently see and think of as me and mine also dissolve. So the awareness continues, but it gives rise to new appearances. First, from the Buddhist point of view, it will, for most of us, give rise to the appearances of the so-called transitory state, famously known as the bardo, and which is a general term used for any sort of transition, but in particular, most people associate, in the West at least, associate it with this transition between one life and the other. So that's sort of a temporary state in between existences, we could say, in which, in this dream-like kind of hallucinatory flow or stream of experiences, we roam around a little bit, essentially, getting ready for our next rebirth. And then eventually, after that ends, and for most people, it doesn't last for more than 49 days, and for many, not even that. After that's over, we will end up in a different set of experiences, in a different set of appearances. And in that new set of appearances, we will give rise to another course personality, which will have a different name and a different form and a different personal history and so forth. And we will give rise, in a way, to other types of appearances that we perceive as external to ourselves. So this holographic illusion will dissolve and another holographic illusion will unfold, unless we get realized right now or in the process of dying or in the bardo, and those are all, from a Buddhist point of view, genuinely available options. It is possible to develop the realization while dying. It is possible to access realization while kind of in these transitory states between life and death. But if not, we will just end up in another dream similar to this one. And this is actually bringing us back to the heart of Lojong in general. So this is once again sort of a reminder or the general contextualization for these teachings. So where do they come from? They come from the idea, which is foundational to Buddhism, that our mental energy is malleable, that we can change its shape, we can change its form, we can at will, and in particular through training, change the mental states that we experience. We're not just a victim of our brain. We're not a victim of our brain's chemistry. We're not victims of external circumstances. We can change the mental states and the interpretations and the emotions and the desires and our attitudes and our overall view and experience of reality through training, because the energy of awareness is flexible. But it becomes flexible through training, through these inner yogas, the yogas of attitude bending amongst them. Because initially, yes, we do have very strong patterns that control us quite strongly. But through training, we can make those patterns much more flexible. And then eventually, the unhelpful ones we can completely remove, the helpful ones we can fully strengthen. Lojong, in particular, is actually quite strong, can be connected quite powerfully to these ideas related to bardo and rebirth and so forth. And of course, if we're not Buddhist and or we're just an agnostic, or maybe our worldview is that of materialism, we don't have to accept any of these Buddhist working hypotheses, which from a Buddhist point of view can be fully proven. We can prove them indeed through practice and training, but we don't have to accept them. But the general idea there is that, and this is kind of taking a step back, everything that we experience can be divided into two things. Everything that exists can be divided into two main categories. And the definition of an existent phenomenon in Buddhism is that which can be cognized by someone's mind. So things that can be cognized genuinely are the things that exist. Things that by definition cannot be cognized are non-existent. That's how existence is defined in Buddhism. So a very famous example of a non-existent phenomena is chicken lips. That's my favorite one. Chickens don't have lips. So you can never cognize the lips of a chicken because the chicken doesn't have lips. That's a non-cognizable phenomenon, therefore it doesn't exist. Or Lobsang's son. Lobsang doesn't have a son, so you can't cognize Lobsang's son. But you can cognize, let's say, the apples that I have in my kitchen. You can, through perception, come and smell them and touch them and so forth. So, okay, that exists, sort of, conventionally at least. How it exists is a whole big other thing that explored in the Buddhist meditations on wisdom. But generally, we can say, yes, conventionally, we would agree that those apples exist. So everything that exists from a Buddhist point of view is divided into two main categories. Uh, and this is a classification that in particular comes from the yogic teachings, not from the academic teachings in Buddhist philosophy, but from the yogic teachings. The two categories are appearances and awareness. So that which is perceived and experienced, and that which experiences and perceives. So, sort of very roughly speaking, object and subject, the objects that we experience and the part of us that is experiencing them. So the objects are the appearances, these holographic illusions that we're going through, including those of apples and computers and tables and our thoughts and memories. And that the part which experiences them with different flavors to it is our awareness, the cognizant part, the knowing part, the experiencing part. So, from a Buddhist point of view, both of these can be changed. We can change the appearances and we can change the awareness. With regards to appearances, we primarily change them through actually doing something to them. That's the short-term perspective. So I can go into my kitchen, take an apple, slice it up. Okay, I've changed this appearance of an apple. That's very straightforward. We all know how to do these things already without Buddhism or any of those other systems. Just take an apple and change it. That's fairly straightforward. And of course, there's greater and greater sophistication with regards to what we can do with appearances coming through modern science. We didn't know how to work with the appearance known as, let's say, atomic energy, and now we do a little bit, for better or worse. So, okay, we're learning stuff about how to work with appearances. And then a more long-term perspective in Buddhism is how to change appearances through working with our karma. Because at the end of the day, and that's how Buddhists see it, all of the appearances that we come across are determined by certain imprints left in our mental continuum. And if we change those imprints, we change the appearances that we come across. So, how to explain the idea, the fact that some people live in one environment and others end up in another environment? Why do several friends living the same party end up in very different places as the night goes on? How do we explain that, let's say, two twins born at the same time with similar genetics end up in very different places in their life and end up doing very different things and having very different experiences? That's what Buddhists contemplate with regards to this theory or working hypothesis of karma. But that's all appearances. And then at a more advanced level, you can change some of those appearances in a more immediate manner, in the same way that you would be changing the aspects of a lucid dream through being lucid in a dream. But then the other part of us, awareness, can also be changed. We can't change its primordial nature, its nature of being cognizant and clear. That can't change. That can never be changed. And from a Buddhist point of view, that can never be extinguished as well. But what we can change are these flavors of awareness. So the flavors of awareness that we bring to an apple, the flavors of awareness that we bring to a situation, to each other, really how we perceive all of these dreamlike experiences. And they are, in a way, dreamlike for multiple reasons, but amongst other things, there's this foundational, kind of slightly provocative Buddhist idea that says we can never, using logic or any other means, definitively prove that any of our experiences are more than a mere hallucination. We can never definitively prove that any of the things we're experiencing right now are not simply an elaborate, very lucid, a very vivid dream, non-lucid dream for most of us, actually. We can never prove that these appearances of matter, tables, apples, strange ex-Buddhist monk talking at you, through Zoom. We can never prove that all of these things are not a hallucination. There's always that element of doubt that would remain, which is suspended to keep going on with our lives, saying, yes, my life is totally real. let me do all the stuff that I like to do and avoid the stuff that I don't like to do, all of that. But the one thing that can be definitively proven through experience is the very fact that we're aware. The appearances might all be completely ridiculously uh, illusory, just like they are in a dream. But awareness itself is a fact, and this is a fact that remains with us in this thing we call our waking life or our waking state, and then in a dream, and then beyond that, no matter what's happening, even when we are in a deep dreamless sleep where we only perceive sort of blackness and heaviness. In all of these situations, awareness remains. And because it's the awareness that always remains with all of its different flavors like hatred, desire, compassion, love, joy, and so forth, it does make sense to pay a lot of attention to our awareness and to primarily work with it. And then on a secondary base, kind of as our second step, yes, we can also learn to work with appearances, hopefully to make them more balanced, more harmonious, more helpful to each and every sentient being. So that's how Buddhists generally have been working with reality for centuries, for thousands of years now. And that explains why Tibet never developed advanced technology beyond that of a will and a prayer will, which is just making taking a will and turning into a meditation tool. But Tibet did go to extremely advanced discoveries and extremely advanced levels when it comes to this awareness transformation, changing the flavors of awareness so as to experience happiness. And that did come in extremely handy when the occupation and destruction of Tibet happened, in particular because, as I mentioned previously, some people had to undergo extreme suffering in concentration camps, amongst other things, and yet they were able to remain happy, lucid, clear, compassionate, blissful, despite being taken to the torture chamber on a daily basis. And they were able to maintain those levels of inner well being, not through being deluded and lying to themselves, but through, at will, transforming the energy of their awareness through teachings such as Lojong, in particular through Lojong teachings, because these are the main tools that were developed in India and then in Tibet to make sure we can transform our experiences into happiness. So the first level of Lojong training in this sequence presented here to us by Manjushri is to learn how to see the long-term perspective and to cling to the so-called eight worldly dharmas less, or eight worldly concerns, which we talked about previously. The more energy we pour into this level of training, into this step, the more our overall system of attitudes changes and shifts. Obviously, because we see reality through a different lens now, we see that, yes, indeed, this life will end. And therefore, it maybe makes sense to have other priorities or to maybe keep some of our original priorities, but add some new ones and so forth. And this is where these two questions come in that we ended on last time, sort of as a journaling exercise, hopefully, but also as a thing that we can contemplate in meditation, like we did just now. What would it be like to see my current life as a precious and extremely rare opportunity to cultivate wisdom and compassion? That's something that we contemplate in the precious human life system of meditations. And then how would I act if I knew this opportunity is fleeting? And so every moment has to be used wisely. And so this idea of using every moment wisely, of course, would be tackled differently by different people and by different systems, by different worldviews. The ideas of using every moment wisely within a reductive materialist worldview, the answer to this would be different from a reductionist materialist point of view as opposed to, let's say, the Buddhist worldview or any other worldview that at least allows for the possibility that our awareness will continue to exist past the moment of dying. So, of course, the followers of the Abrahamic traditions do have these ideas of stuff happening after death. The followers of the four Dharmic traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, and Sikhism, equally have ideas of what does happen after death. Similarly, these ideas were contemplated by ancient Greeks. Pythagoras, in particular, claimed to know quite a few of his past lives and was teaching meditation of a sort to his followers and so forth. So it's sort of an idea that humanity has been playing with for a very long time. And if we allow for that idea to at least be, once again, a working hypothesis or something that we're contemplating, exploring, playing with, it does immediately change our attitude towards every moment of this current life as well. And so this is where we do such meditations as the threefold meditation on death, the ninefold meditation on death, and so forth, as sort of the main practice. But what is added to it in the more elaborate presentations, a contemplation of karma and the laws of karma and the general principles of how karma operates within our mind. The understanding that our next hallucinatory dream, our next life, quote unquote, can be very different from this one. And in particular, it can be much more unfortunate. Our abilities might be much more limited. The level of suffering we might experience might be much higher. Why? Well, because causes and conditions. So what causes do we want to create to make sure that the result that we will reap in terms of our next next set of experiences, our next set of appearances and awareness would be as good as this one, if not better. And this is where Buddhists have a whole practical science of making sure your next rebirth is as good as this one. And that's sort of the minimum, the most foundational thing to do from a Buddhist point of view to make sure that this life was not misused. It was not basically lost as an opportunity. So to at least make sure we, while investing this life into different activities, we get as a return another life that's as good as this one in terms of providing us with a certain level of happiness, certain level of freedom, and in particular the opportunity to practice the Dharma even more so that we can go past the first line and apply higher stages of training. And for the second stage of training, Manjushri and the followers of the Sakya tradition who wrote commentaries to this text invite us to contemplate this whole sequence of illusory appearances, this whole sequence of temporary lifetimes in general. So not just this life and clinging to it, but now clinging to this entire cycle of uncontrollable, largely, rebirth. So the line reads, if you cling to the three realms, that is not renunciation. And as it says here on the slide, clinging to the continuation of non-liberated existence in samsara is still a problem, even if it goes beyond the limitations of this life. So we might already think in bigger terms. We might no longer be just thinking of this very life alone, which is the first step in training. But even if we're no longer thinking of just this life and we're thinking, okay, I will work to make sure I have a good rebirth in my next life. Let's say another human rebirth, or maybe even rebirth as a blissful being made of light energy that can frolic and just enjoy life for thousands and millions and billions of years, which from a Buddhist point of view is a type of temporary rebirth that can also unfold for us if we create the causes for that. So even if we're already at that stage thinking of those things, thinking, oh, I would like to go to this temporary realm of bliss, sort of this pleasant set of experiences, fly around, have fun with my friends, just enjoy life, drink ambrosia, eat heavenly grapes, all of that, play harp or whatever they play in those realms. Even if we're at that level, the Buddha and his followers, including Manjushri and others, are saying, well, it would still mean that you are controlled by something that's basically not you. You will still be controlled by the imprints you have in your stream of consciousness. And even if those imprints do give you a temporary pleasurable experience, once that ends, you would once again be at the mercy of the winds of your own karma. And who knows where you might end up. In fact, it's not who knows. You will end up in a worse situation compared to that temporary situation of bliss that you created for yourself. And then it's kind of back to ground zero. And It would just keep going on and on and on and on because you still don't have lucidity in this process. You still don't have the control over these dreams. You want to create a better dream, which is fine, but wouldn't it be better to become lucid? And then from that space of lucidity to control the very flow of appearances by primarily controlling your awareness of them. So this is where Buddhists develop the full-on renunciation. The previous line was talking about the foundational level of renunciation, the renunciation of this life. And the second line is talk about renunciation in general. And this is where it's important to remember that this term renunciation has a very particular meaning in Buddhism. And in particular, it refers to us renouncing our grasping at the more limited types of happiness to so that we can also cultivate the more genuine, long-lasting types of happiness. So it's basically a level of maturity that's implied. It's not about renouncing our clothes or our houses, our partners, and all of those sorts of things, unless necessary, and unless we choose a different lifestyle, let's say of a cave practitioner or a monastic practitioner. But renunciation in general is just a level of maturity with regards to the different things we see as the potential causes of happiness. And when we do have renunciation proper, we recognize that all the hedonic factors, all the outer types of stimulation, are extremely limited in their ability to provide us with happiness, and in particular with long-lasting happiness. So while we do enjoy them, and while we do pay some attention to them because we do need food, we do need clothes, we do need water, we do need shelter, we do need medical care, we do need the company of others. While we do pay some attention to those things, we don't pour the entirety of our awareness into them. We also work on the cultivation of eudaimonic factors, the factors that bring about genuine inner well-being. So we do also spend time actively cultivating wisdom, cultivating compassion, creating positive imprints in our mental stream, and that's what good karma is, and so forth. So that eventually we can actually not simply accumulate a certain amount of these factors, but even make a revolutionary step towards the next level of psychological evolution, and then the next step, and then the next step, until we get to the very pinnacle of this evolutionary process in which we have completely liberated our mind. So at this stage in practice, to once again rebend our attitudes, practitioners would be contemplating such topics as the suffering nature of samsara, or of this kind of unenlightened existence, non-liberated existence. They would be contemplating the very first teaching of the Buddha, known as the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Facts for the Aryas, which is a sort of a more precise translation for it. They would be contemplating the teaching on the 12 links of dependent origination, which is an elaborate explanation of how each rebirth unfolds and how we keep perpetuating this non-lucid stream of existences, and so forth. So there are different analytical meditations that are done there. And at the conclusion of each of those meditations, we generate a very powerful wish to become liberated from all of this nonsense, to become lucid in this sort of endless or very extensive dream, to gain control over it all by gaining control over our mind. And that is the renunciation. The Tibetan term for renunciation, ngejung, can also be translated as spirit of emergence, or basically the definitive emergence, that which definitively emerges, kind of the wish to definitively emerge out of this non-lucid state. So we kind of want to break the egg, and to gain control over it all. And the way we do that is through then cultivating a foundation of ethical intelligence, through cultivating concentration, and through cultivating wisdom, which are the three trainings in Buddhism, the kind of three foundational types of inner education that we need to eventually master. But before we can master those, we need this foundational motivation. And across all the Buddhist traditions, we need at least this one of renunciation. In the great vehicle tradition of Mahayana, we on top of that need what is described in the next line, and that's the so-called aspiration of bodhicitta. But just to revisit the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Facts for the Noble Beings, that are contemplated sometimes in at this stage of training, where we're trying to cultivate full the full renunciation, as opposed to the more limited one that we were working with at this first stage. We contemplate the fact that there is sort of this all-pervasive discomfort or suffering, or dukkha, as it's known as in Pali and Sanskrit, that is a part of our life, of our existence, and we need to recognize that very clearly, and not simply recognize the more obvious types of suffering, such as physical pain or emotional heartbreak and so forth. No, Buddhism takes us into much deeper levels of this, where we contemplate also a more subtle type of suffering known as the suffering of change. And that's basically the fact that our hedonic pleasure can never remain as pleasure, and it inevitably always transforms into at least neutrality, but in most cases also unpleasant experiences. You're eating your chocolate cake, and after a while, it will become a source of suffering. It no longer brings pleasure. Every new spoonful is taking you from bliss to neutrality, and then to actually aversion and disgust, and feeling nauseous and so forth. So that's the so-called suffering of change, in a very simplified form. And then beyond that, there's the so-called all-pervasive suffering of being conditioned, which is the very fact that our body and mind, through still being under the influence of foundational ignorance, will always give rise to discomfort, will always give rise to suffering. There's sort of this foundational illness that we have, the illness of being conditioned by samsaric factors. And in recognizing that, we can then generate this unique aspiration to liberate ourselves from it, to transform this. And all of that happens when we're contemplating this very first line, or this very first statement, the very fact that there is dukkha, this unsatisfactory quality to the samsaric experiences. But this dukkha is caused by something, and this is where we contemplate the second statement, that of the reality of the causes. In particular, from a Buddhist point of view, the causes boil down to two things. Karma, once again, those imprints left in our mental stream by our intentions in particular, or for simplicity, we can say our actions, even though we don't always have to enact a certain impulse in order for it to leave a karmic imprint. So those are the imprints that condition our behavior and our experiences. And so that's the main thing, sort of the first thing. But the second thing is more important, and that is our mental distortions, or our delusions, or our afflictions. The original Sanskrit term is klesha, and that gets translated into our modern European languages in different ways. Some translators prefer the term affliction, some mental distortion, delusion, many other versions as well. But essentially, it refers to these mental states which distort our vision of reality, giving us tunnel vision. And on top of that, they also in themselves feel as a type of suffering. Anger, if we really look at how we feel when we experience it, does have an unpleasant quality to it. It can temporarily make us feel energized, but what it does as a mental distortion is that it makes us see reality in a very particular, limited way. And on top of that, it doesn't actually feel blissful. There is a somewhat unpleasant quality to it if we really look deeply into it. The same actually is true for our neurotic desire, our desire that's not balanced, the type of desire that also gives us tunnel vision and disturbs the mind. And the same is true of all the other mental afflictions. There are elaborate lists of them. There are elaborate lists of them, but there are also these quintessential lists, which, for example, include 3 points or 5 points or 6 points and so forth. And there's a very famous list of the 3 foundational poisons that form the root of all of our samsaric experiences. And those are ignorance, neurotic desire or attachment, and aversion. And then when you expand that into 5, you have the 5 foundational mental poisons of ignorance, attachment, aversion, pride, and jealousy or envy. So whichever of these lists we work with, those are the main causes of our suffering. But, and this is where we can revisit the foundational statement related to Lojong teachings in particular, while acknowledging the importance of karma and afflictions as the causes of suffering, Lojong takes us straight to the very root of those by saying that all of those stem from the two foundational enemies, self-grasping and self-cherishing or self-centeredness, the king and his minister. So we need to recognize those and then to develop a very strong aspiration to get rid of those, and then we need to start the actual process. When we would complete that process, we would come to the reality of cessation, removing suffering, because the causes of suffering are removed, removing dukkha. And then the reality of the path is the fact that there are actual things that can be done. There are actual types of awareness flexing, awareness bending that can be applied so that mental poisons are eradicated. They're uprooted and removed. So how do we do that? Well, this is where we learn about the path and the different presentations of the path. And there are many different presentations of the path that are suitable for different types of practitioners. So there's generally sort of this idea in Buddhism that the Buddha taught 84,000 teachings or 84,000 types of practice for different people. And that's a bit of an exaggerated statement in a way, in that it's not precisely 84,000 maybe. But when you look at all the different Buddhist traditions and all the different combinations of practices that you could use to cover all the major categories that you need to work with, you actually arrive at a greater number. There are so many concentration practices. There are so many wisdom practices. There are so many practices, versions of practices for cultivating love and compassion and so forth, that if you try to think of all the potential combinations, well, it probably would be more than 84,000. So in a way, there's actually a huge variety of methods that we could use, but no matter which unique combination of methods we use, that combination needs to cover all the sort of general dietary groups that need to be present in our spiritual diet. Otherwise, we would not have the complete healing, medicine cocktail that's necessary for us to fully remove the causes of suffering. And all of this is contemplated actively in analytical meditations and also in the just study sessions and reflection sessions and debate sessions and journaling sessions in order for us to perform this second type of mind bending, the one that would lead us to the development of full renunciation. So this is a type of work that's done by people, and the foundational aspects we can do right now, we actually have done sort of a foundational level of it by just contemplating these four facts for the noble beings, or the four noble truths, on this very, very, very preliminary foundational level. But we did it on the level of so-called listening or reading or learning. Whereas at a deeper level, if we were to take it into our journaling practice, that would, for example, become the wisdom of contemplation. And then beyond that, once we start meditating on it again and again and again and again, that becomes the actual wisdom of meditation, where we do the most immediate form of attitude bending related to the second instruction from Manjushri. The third instruction has to do with bodhicitta itself, and that's the one where love and compassion for others kick in. The first two lines actually are based on having genuine love and compassion for ourselves, where love is defined, or loving kindness is defined as the wish for us to have happiness and the causes of happiness. Compassion is defined as the wish for us to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. We do need those to a great degree in order to even start working with the first two lines. Otherwise, if we don't actually wish for ourselves to be happy and free from suffering, we'd not be motivated to look for the solutions to our suffering. So, what's the point? But once we have worked with all of this, developed a certain degree of renunciation, we step into this third level of training, which has to do with the cultivation of universal love, universal compassion, and in particular, their extremely potent form known as bodhicitta. So bodhicitta, and there are different things that are referred to by this term, but bodhicitta in the most common sense, in its relative form, is an altruistic resolve to fully uncover our nature for the benefit of all sentient beings, or to become fully awakened or enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. So typically, if you were to attend literally any teaching by a holder of the Tibetan lineage, by a genuine master, by a capital L Lama, by a genuine capital T teacher, you would, in the very beginning of those teachings, hear, and now let's generate a good motivation, or please generate once again, please generate the motivation of bodhicitta. And this is the bodhicitta that would be meant in that case, the wish to become fully awakened for the benefit of all sentient beings. So before listening to any Dharma teaching, before doing any sort of Dharma practice, even if we're just reciting Om Mani Padme Hum for 3 minutes, whatever it is that we're doing, observing our breath for a minute or two, it's always said we do need to try to emulate this mode of bodhicitta, to try to, at least on a very foundational level, bend our awareness into this attitude, because having that as the foundational motivation for anything that we're doing will create extremely potent karmic seeds in our mental continuum. It would start transforming everything that we're doing into pure karmic gold, into a source of extremely powerful karmic energy that will be then getting accumulated in our mind and generating, as a result, happiness, and in particular, happiness, the happiness of awakening. It will be paving the way for us to eventually arrive at full awakening. But it would only be able to do that if we generate this attitude, if we plant this foundational motivational seed that then transforms the quality of any activity that we do. If we do generate this motivation at the beginning of any activity that we do, including visiting the toilet or taking a shower or eating or sleeping and so forth, then everything that we do becomes an aspect or sort of an extension of bodhicitta, and it generates this type of interdependence within our mind. That's how it's described in the psychological system. By contrast, if the foundational motivation for all of our activities is not as enlightened or is actually negative, then anything that we're doing is creating negative causality. It's creating negative imprints in our mind. So what we're doing could be, for example, giving money to hungry children or giving food to hungry children. But if our foundational motivation is conjoined with negative mental states, such as the wish to appear generous, to create this false facade, if that's what we're doing, instead of creating positive karma, we're actually creating mixed karma or negative karma. And instead of strengthening the positive factors in our mind, such as love, compassion, wisdom, and so forth, we're actually strengthening the negative aspects of our mind. This is also mentioned very clearly, for example, when teachings on ritual practices are done. Buddhism has a certain array of, and this goes for most branches of Buddhism, by the way, not just Mahayana and Vajrayana, but this is very clear, very strongly present in the Theravada system of practice as well. Buddhism does have a lot of practices that are said to affect the outer interdependence of our life to a certain degree. So we have all these different types of recitations that are done for good fortune, for protection, for abundance, and so forth. And of course, it's never said that they can completely change our outer appearances immediately, but they sort of provide this additional condition that can, in certain ways, change the overall flow of interdependence, and that can, for example, change our outer situation to a certain degree. So there are practices like that, and this is where a lot of the mantra-related practices come in as well. And people know that if you're sick, you can recite the mantra of the medicine Buddha. Maybe that would help to a certain degree. If you have certain outer obstacles, you can recite the mantra of Green Tara, blah, blah, blah. There are all these practices. And it's always said that these practices should never be done, in the Mahayana tradition in particular, where all the mantra practices come in. These practices should never be done with any motivation other than the motivation of bodhicitta, lest they actually create negative karma. So instead of helping, they would hurt. Not because there's anything wrong with the practices, but because our foundational attitude was completely not what it's supposed to be. The foundational attitude for using these practices, reciting all these different types of mantras, performing rituals, asking someone to do rituals for us or do prayers and so forth. The foundational motivation for all of those is supposed to be this motivation of bodhicitta, because it's the ultimate good motivation that exists, the wish to fully awaken for the benefit of all beings. So for us, fully uncovering our amazing potential. For others, us endlessly contributing to their well-being and freedom. So what could be greater than this? So because it's the ultimate good motivation, it creates the ultimate good fortune sort of in our mind when we do any activity that's motivated by this. But this attitude can be generated in a sort of two ways, as a very weak facsimile and as the real thing. This very weak facsimile, this very weak kind of photocopy, like this very weak Temu version of bodhicitta, AliExpress version of bodhicitta can be generated initially when we just say, okay, they said generate the motivation of aspiring for full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. Okay, I'm aspiring for full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. Let's say in the beginning of a teaching session, we kind of do that. Okay, okay, may I be fully awakened for the benefit of all sentient beings. That's just kind of a very, very, very weak ghost of the real thing bodhicitta. It's still extremely valuable, and it will eventually lead us, if we do take those steps, to the actual thing bodhicitta, but it's just sort of an uh, empty word level of it. Not empty, but pretty close to it. It's just a very foundational, just very simple thought that's not yet supercharged by the mental states that need to be present for actual bodhicitta to be present. And yet, of course, it is still extremely valuable. And even if we are just stay at this level, it will leave very powerful, very beautiful imprints in our mind. But the idea there is that we don't remain at this level. We do train to eventually arrive at the full thing bodhicitta. And how do we move in that direction? To cultivate genuine bodhicitta, we progress from self-compassion and self-kindness to their universal forms, then to universal responsibility, and finally onto bodhicitta itself. So these are steps of meditative training. So first you are introduced perhaps to certain meditations related to your own well-being, and many of those are done in the previous types, on the previous levels. When we're working with the first two lines and we're cultivating the so-called attitude of renunciation, what we're really cultivating is this extremely profound and powerful and wise level of self-kindness and self-compassion. Through meditation, you accumulate those hours. And then beyond that, you start extending loving kindness and compassion to others. So this is where it's extremely important to master the meditations on the four immeasurables. And before I forget, I just want to kind of drop the link to our resource page for the course now that it exists. I will keep updating it and adding more and more things to it. But the basic thing is now there, and amongst other things, you will see that there's a thing called related pages on that page, and that includes 3 additional pages that I have. One on the 7 points of mind training, and that's a course we did in 2023 together. Then there's a page on the 4 measurables, so loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity, for extremely important trainings that play a huge role in Buddhism, but are also mentioned in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So that's another reason to know those quite well, if there's a wish. And there's a page also on the 37 practices of bodhisattvas, which is another very important Lojong text as well. So, but this whole page will be getting updated, and I'll add the videos of our sessions together and the guided meditations and so forth, so that there's a chance to play with it a bit more. But so mastering the 4 immeasurables, genuinely cultivating universal loving kindness and universal compassion, then stepping from just that to accepting responsibility for the well-being and freedom of all sentient beings, saying, I will contribute to the happiness of all sentient beings. I will contribute to the freedom for all sentient beings. So that's the next level of meditation, sometimes referred to as the great loving kindness, or the great compassion. Stepping from the universal loving kindness to the great loving kindness, the one that takes responsibility. And it takes responsibility not from the point of view of this very limited person here, but from the point of view of the boundless potential hidden within our Buddha nature, let's say. From that point of view, there's an infinite energy there, and an infinite ability, and infinite wisdom, and infinite love. So I'm going to be using that is going to actively contribute to the well-being of others, not just this very limited person that temporarily exists as sort of a hallucinatory dream for itself and for others. But that boundlessness that's hidden within, that will endlessly contribute to the well-being of all who live once that boundlessness is uncovered. And then eventually from there, stepping to the very stage of saying, I will therefore become awakened for the benefit of all sentient beings. And all of these steps, so there are different sequences that are described in different traditions, as in like meditate on this and now meditate on that. And so there's some flexibility there. But whichever of these sequences we use, we accumulate hours for each of the stages, many, many hours. Even to cultivate boundless or limitless or immeasurable loving kindness, that's a lot of work. It's extremely rewarding work because that in itself actually brings a great experience of bliss already. And now through modern science, we also know that it does bring a lot of outer benefits in that it affects our epigenetic processes, it affects our heart health, it affects our blood pressure, it affects this, it affects that, it makes us less racist, less xenophobic, less misogynistic, blah, 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 blah. All of these effects are being discovered through, carefully constructed experiments that are done by modern science. And once again, Mind and Life podcast and just the activity of the Mind and Life Institute is a great resource for those things. Or the Greater Good Center. I mentioned that last time as well. But here, from the Buddhist point of view, the main benefit is that we are actually uncovering our amazing potential with each stage of training, but each stage needs to be done. And we need to invest hours, tens of hours, hundreds of hours, thousands of hours, depending on what it is specifically that we're trying to accomplish, and depending on what our own natural giftedness in that is. So some people would have a great giftedness when it comes to loving kindness, so it would be easy for them to master that quickly. But then it would take much longer for them to master wisdom. Some people are great with wisdom practices, but they will need more time to walk through the stages of training in loving kindness. Some people are great at everything. Some people are not great at anything. Doesn't matter. It's like physical training. You train this muscle group and then that muscle group and this and this and this and that. And eventually you arrive at the level of fitness that you were trying to accomplish. So the same thing here. It's not like there's an alternative anyway, if we understand the truthfulness of these things. So we just gently, slowly, slowly work at all of those things. And at this stage, this third stage, we put the main emphasis on his meditations related to loving kindness, compassion, and altruism. This doesn't mean that we're not allowed to train in those before we arrive at this stage. We can, for example, use loving kindness as an important practice in our personal collection of medicines, because loving kindness, amongst other things, is a wonderful concentration technique. And so it just can be our primary concentration practice if we wish. And we're working with it to just strengthen our ability to concentrate so as to use that then as the tool for everything else we're doing in Lojong training. Or we can just be doing loving kindness because we like it. And that sort of becomes our main practice, sort of the red thread that we put through every other method. But on top of that loving kindness training, we do need to, if we wish to go through this entire path that's presented here in this text, we need to go through the other stages as well, accumulating the necessary amount of hours in them and mastering these types of attitude bending. And then once we have mastered that, the fourth line in the sequence says, if grasping arises, it is not the view, or basically what it's saying, your mental state is not the correct view. It is not representative of the correct view. You do not possess the correct view. That's what it means. That's what it means. In this case, just reading out what it says on my slide. In this case, clinging refers to grasping at the misprint here, at the exaggerated existence status of anything, including the self of persons and the self of all phenomena. So sort of the identity of persons, including ourself, and the identity of phenomena. And here identity is not used in the modern sense of that word, where we have certain um, um, certain qualities and aspects and things we associate with ourselves, including our age group, our gender, and identity, and so forth. That's not what's meant here, even though those things can also be a part of it, but primarily the very fact that I do exist as a person. There is a self. There's somewhere within me this part called the self. called I, some part that's independent of body and mind, or is hidden in the body and mind, or is controlling the body and mind. So those kinds of feelings, these are explored at this stage in great depth. And the same thing for phenomena. Let's say looking at my coffee mug, oh, there is something in this mug that makes it a mug. It does exist truly as this object. So all those kinds of projections, cognitive projections that habitually exist within our mind. And sometimes on top of them, we'll learn certain ideas like that through studying certain philosophies as well. So to remove all the incorrect types of perception, we do wisdom practices. Uh, Most of those wisdom practices fall under the general heading of vipassana or vipassana, which is a general term for insight practices in Buddhism. Many people have heard of Vipassana retreats, and those are just originally they were retreats that were primarily centered around insight practices, but in this day and age, even that original meaning has disappeared. So you might go to a Vipassana retreat and actually not do any Buddhist meditation at all in this day and age because people are just making stuff up at this stage, but still using that original term because it's good for marketing. But originally, the term Vipassana is in Pali, Vipassana is in Sanskrit, is used to refer to insight practices. So practices in which we use our ability to discern, to correctly discern the nature of different things. And there are Vipassana practices in which we explore the quality of impermanence or transitoriness. There are Vipassana practices in which we explore the quality of selflessness or the absence of a truly identifiable self. There are Vipassana practices for identifying emptiness. So all of these different practices, and there are similar practices in other traditions as well, perhaps not always as elaborate as in Buddhism, but there are Vipassana practices in Christianity and so forth, and Sufism and so forth. There are practices in which we try to understand correctly the nature of something, primarily seeing it as simply being is simply temporarily and conventionally arising within the matrix of interdependence. And in order to do these insight practices, people follow different paths. Chogyam Rinpoche, one of my primary mentors, once again, often says that there are the three traditions for doing this. There's the elaborate tradition of study and reflection on the view, and that is the one that is pursued by, in particular, monastics that are studying in the great monastic colleges. So they study for 10 years, 20 years in some cases to really master all the foundational Buddhist treatises on wisdom. And on top of that, they also study foundations of psychology and epistemological teachings and so forth. But the main emphasis is to eventually study these teachings on wisdom to use them as the foundation for one's meditation. And it's very important that someone does that because if we lose this tradition of study and reflection, we will really lose a lot of the very important presentations on how to do these practices correctly. So it's very important and very noble that there are monks and nuns doing this, and in this day and age, more and more lay people as well, as they are allowed into these great institutions. But this is an elaborate approach, and it's relatively slow, and you go through all these great treatises, and you study them, and you contemplate them, and then you apply it all in meditation. So that's one approach. Another approach is known as the approach of the pith instructions. In the approach of the pith instructions, you're guided by a qualified teacher. And in order for you to be guided in the teachings on wisdom, that teacher needs to be qualified and ideally fully realized in those teachings of wisdom. But you are ideally guided by a qualified teacher who just gives you, once again, pith instructions. They're just quintessential instructions on how to cultivate wisdom through doing this specific thing here, this specific practice there. It's much less elaborate. And it's actually very close in style to Lojong itself, this whole genre of teachings, in which you just receive practical suggestions for what to do without going through very elaborate studies of innumerable pages. So you get these pith instructions and then you apply them. And then at the next stage, you get another instruction, then you apply that. And through that, you slowly liberate your mind from everything that is not in the nature of wisdom. So that's a more quintessential approach, much less elaborate, but very effective if you have a certain amount of faith and trust, and if you're practicing this, obviously, under the guidance of a truly qualified teacher. So that's kind of the second approach. And then the third approach, which is extremely rare and doesn't happen very often in general in history, but in particular in our times, is the approach of the so-called direct transference. And that is an approach in which, if you are an extremely qualified and talented student, and if you meet an extremely qualified and talented teacher through the karmic causes and conditions already being present there, the teacher can sort of transfer their realization to you. In actuality, there's no transferring happening, but the teacher helps you immediately activate your own deepest nature. And through that, the realizations of the teacher and the student become equally high, not equally low. But that happens extremely rarely, and it's said that it really only happens for people who've done all the work in their previous lifetimes. It's just kind of reactivation of everything that's been built up. So for most of us, the first two approaches are the main ones we might want to play with. It's perfectly possible to combine them, to do some formal studies, and then also to receive pith instructions and practice with them. And actually, for many people in this day and age, that's what's advisable. His Holiness the Dalai Lama always says we need to be 21st century Buddhists. And that means that we do need to have a thorough and logical understanding on Buddhist philosophy and psychology, so as to be able to explain it to others when they just ask questions like, what is it that you're doing at those retreats? You go all the way out to Portugal, and what do you do? What is it that you're doing there? Chanting mantras all day, or just looking at your navel, or what's happening there? So it's to be able to explain then to people that, oh no, I'm doing this and that because it's been proven, and also logically speaking, it has these benefits related to this and this, and it affects the cognitive aspect of your mind, and it seems to also affect the epigenetic aspect, all of those sorts of things. Very good to be able to explain them to ourselves and to others, because then they will be able to at least say, okay. And to ourselves, because if we ever encounter someone who's skeptical or even cynical about this stuff, but we do genuinely know that these practices do have these positive effects, they do bring these benefits, we would not lose our faith just because someone is suddenly cynical about it. And that's very important for us to be able to continue with our practice. And of course, it's extremely good to actually be doing something that is logically valid and that is aligned with interdependence and love and compassion, as opposed to going on some journey that's completely wild and will instead lead us to, let's say, a place of extreme, being extremely judgmental towards others because we suddenly feel that we're extremely spiritually superior, blah, blah, blah. Whereas in reality, of course, we're severely lacking compassion and wisdom and so on. So to have a clear understanding, very good. That's why some amount of study is definitely recommended. But on top of that, then pith instructions help us gain the experiences quite fast. And so study helps us contextualize those experiences and to make sure that the experiences are valid, whereas pith instructions help us gain the experiences. And so it's a good idea to combine them generally. That's what Chogyam Rinpoche also suggests. And he is the master who often describes these three general approaches. So, yeah. And so these are the ways we use to work with this aspect of wisdom. On a foundational level, we sort of start developing this wisdom even when we just contemplate the principle of impermanence. Not just related to our own life, but impermanence in general. But there are much deeper stages of training related to selflessness and emptiness. And to master those, we need to study them slowly, and progress through the ideas related to them. And as an additional resource, when we were doing the course on the 7 points of mind training, and that whole thing is linked on the resource page that I included, that did include sort of a preliminary presentation of those wisdom practices and some practices themselves. So that could be one of the next stages in this progression after we complete this course. So we've covered all the 4 lines, and basically that's kind of how Manjushri suggests we train. We first develop this aspiration for genuine well-being that transcends simply the hedonic pleasures of this life. We then develop the full form of renunciation by recognizing, hey, I might want to develop full lucidity with regards to the stream of my experiences, not just transition from this good, relatively good dream to another relatively good dream. Not just that. No, actual lucidity. Why not? Then we recognize, well, to gain the fullness of lucidity, I need to uncover my amazing potential for love and compassion. That's an indispensable step in this path towards full awakening. And then, of course, do need to remove the incorrect perception, the incorrect view, by working with the correct view through using the practices of wisdom. And there are many styles of those practices. Some are sort of more immediate and work in particular with recognizing the true nature of our own awareness, while some do take us on a journey of trying to understand the correct nature of appearances first. And then we work with the true nature of awareness that cognizes the appearances. But there are all these approaches. We all have different connections and different propensities, so there's lots to play with if we wish. So that's our first Lojong text. Why we covered that is because it covers sort of the stages of the path in their correct order. And then the next text, which is actually extremely popular in terms of day-to-day Lojong training, the 8 verses of mind training, it reverses the sequence. It is meant to be used as a very helpful tool for making sure we stay in contact with our love and compassion. And in particular, it is meant for us to slowly, slowly remove our cherishing or our self-centeredness. And then on the basis of that, we'll be able to deal with our self-grasping. So it first presents the teachings on how to chip away at our self-grasp, self-cherishing, self-centeredness, selfishness, basically. And then towards the end, it brings us back to both renunciation and wisdom. So in the straightforward presentation, it's first renunciation, then bodhicitta, then wisdom, right? And here in the 8 verses of mind training, it's first bodhicitta, and then both renunciation and wisdom. And that's because this text is just meant for a different thing. It's meant to help us deal with difficult situations and, in particular, difficult relationships in our life, or all sorts of relationships in our life. So it's very largely about actually our connection to other people or other sentient beings in general. And today we'll just speak very briefly about the first verse. And so the context for this teaching is that, yes, it does come from Atisha's lineage, and we talked about that one in the very first class, kind of describing how those teachings came to Tibet and so forth. And this is actually the earliest text that was written down in that tradition, because up to a certain point it was merely oral, transmitted secretly from master to disciple. But then Langri Tangpa, who's here on the left, actually wrote down this particular instruction as the very first gift to us as practitioners of the future generations. And since then, it has become an absolute classic. His Holiness the Dalai Lama sometimes gives people the commitment to just recite it every day. He does himself recite it every day and meditate on it every day. And there are many, many other masters with wonderful commentaries on it. It's a very simple, elegant, short teaching that is extremely radical at the same time, as we shall see. And then the very first verse in it says, and this is a translation by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who taught this text elaborately. He not only taught this text elaborately, he also composed a certain practice of the Buddha of compassion combined with this text. So this, I'm just dropping links into the chat. This is the translation of the root text by Zopa Rinpoche. And for those who like visualizations and so forth, and do like the Om Mani Padme Hum mantra, there is a wonderful practice on it called the ever-flowing nectar of bodhicitta that I'm also dropping in the chat. And on top of that, there's a commentary to that practice, which I'm also dropping. So that's just for your reference if you want to explore those things. But what does this specific verse mean? So first, let's read it. Determined to obtain the greatest possible benefit from all sentient beings who are more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel, I hold them most dear at all times. So the practice itself that we're supposed to do, the mind bending itself, is in the last line. I hold them most dear at all times. So, first thing to do is to imagine it. What would it be like for our mind to always cherish all sentient beings as being most dear, as being most precious? So that's the mind bending that we want to accomplish here, the attitude bending. To meet any sentient being, a rat, a cockroach, your annoying colleague, your beloved friend, your dear child, your difficult relatives that are annoying the crap out of you every time you meet them, no matter whom, meet them. And regardless of these superficial attitudes of, oh, you're annoying me today, you're not annoying me today, all of that, in spite of all of that, that can remain at the surface level. But on a deeper level, always feel you are extremely precious. You are extremely dear. So that's what we're going for with this verse. And in a simple way, we can accomplish that by just going straight for that attitude, just reminding ourselves, hey, this is the training, so I'll just do it, and just transforming our mind into that. Some people would be able to accomplish that because they already have a certain degree of mental flexibility. But for those who don't possess that, Longri Tanpa here presents sort of a simple logical sequence that actually does make sense to Buddhists, a lot of sense to Buddhists, but might not be immediately obvious to those of us who are new to this tradition. And this logical sequence is described in the first 3 lines: determined to obtain the greatest possible benefit from all sentient beings who are more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel. As a side note, I would say that it is possible to see sentient beings as more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel because, from the Buddhist point of view, they all have Buddha nature. So they are all potential Buddhas or Buddhas who are just temporarily under the influence of ignorance and delusion. So that is a logic that can be applied here as well, but it's not commonly described in commentaries to the 8 verses, particularly because this text is particularly studied and practiced in the Gelug tradition, and this tradition does not put that much emphasis on the idea of Buddha nature as something that's already perfect within us. It describes Buddha nature more as a potentiality, sort of an acorn that still needs to be turned into the full oak tree. So for that reason, this idea of Buddha nature is not emphasized here generally, even though we can absolutely, if we wish, think of it as well. Instead, what's used here is a logical consideration of the fact that unless we start to cherish all sentient beings, we will never be able to uncover or cultivate our bodhicitta, and before that, our loving kindness and compassion. We can only cultivate those if we have sentient beings. And to develop bodhicitta, you actually need all sentient beings. Because if you are still excluding 1 or 2 or 70 or 70,000, you don't have universal loving kindness. Therefore, it is impossible to generate bodhicitta proper. So all sentient beings need to be present as a cooperative condition for universal loving kindness to arise, for universal compassion to arise, for bodhicitta to arise. And so by simply existing, all sentient beings present us with this incredible opportunity for us to walk towards our full awakening. They serve as a necessary cooperative condition that allows us to uncover our amazing potential. So just for that reason, they're infinitely kind and infinitely precious through their own existence, even if they are the most evil person alive, temporarily, once again. It's all a temporary configuration of a dream. But even if right now they're the biggest boo-boo, political, horrible person we can think of, that person is still one of the necessary objects that allow us to uncover our potential for wisdom, love, compassion, and bodhicitta. Without them, it won't work. If we exclude them, it won't work. As long as we're excluding them, it doesn't work. By simply existing, they present us with this opportunity to tap into our deepest potential for bliss, love, compassion, wisdom, uncover that, and become awakened. Of course, you could say it's also a loop because, okay, I want to become awakened for the benefit of all sentient beings. So I want to become awakened for them, but I can only get awakened in relying on them. If I don't rely on them, well, I won't actually get awakened. So kind of it is a loop, yes, no problem with that. It is a circular logic in a way, but both sides of the equation are true. Yes, we do want to become awakened for the benefit of all sentient beings, but in the process of doing that, we will arrive at the highest bliss possible for any consciousness to experience, for any mind to experience. And then on the flip side of that, in order to arrive at that, yes, I do need to rely on each sentient being. Each sentient being is a precious object of love, compassion, and bodhicitta. Therefore, I will now start learning to see them through this specific lens. This doesn't mean that they're most dear in terms of their behavior or their views or the way they're contributing to the world right now. Their current contributions might be completely atrocious, that's all true. But in terms of their quintessential nature of just being a sentient being that exists and is a worthy object of love and compassion simply because they exist. And from that point of view, I will try to see them as most dear, as precious. And so one simple way to start working with this is to print out this first verse or write it out on a card, put it somewhere where you can see it, and regularly look at it and regularly read it. And then as you interact with beings, or even as you just take pauses, let's say you're working at your desk, you take a pause, and then for a moment you think, each and every sentient being that I know, I will try to see for the next 20 seconds as precious. And then you just think of all the sentient beings you know and you try to see them through this lens. Or you look around, you see your cat, you see your relatives, you see your friends, you look outside the window, you see some beings, and you try to see them with these eyes of cherishing, with these eyes of seeing them as precious. And that's attitude bending. Initially, it might be difficult, or it might feel very kind of artificial, convoluted, contrived. That's natural because we're just starting. We are just starting to rebend our mental energy into this new shape. It's as if we were trying to adopt a new position, a new physical position that we've never done before. It takes time to build up to it for some people. Some people are naturally fit and they can just do it organically the first time they're shown a particular position, but some people take months, if not years, to arrive at something. And it's the same with mind training. But the way to do it is to play with it in the skillful inner acting kind of way. So it's an acting exercise, except in this case, we're not just trying to create the outer appearance. We're doing method acting. We're going within and we're trying from within to leave this to the best of our ability. So that's kind of my invitation for the next week. Yeah, in the previous week, we were meditating on death and impermanence, or on the preciousness of human birth, and that was more a formal meditation. In this case, for the next week, yes, there are formal meditations on seeing beings as precious, and that just means that we're calm down, and then we try to consider the logic that's described in this verse. And then we see beings as precious, and on top of that, we can send them loving kindness or compassion or both. But in this case, the kind of the training for the next week is also informal, and that is stopping and trying to turn on these eyes of cherishing, and then trying to look at beings through these eyes of cherishing for a few seconds here and there, and then seeing how it affects our experience and whether it works and whether it was difficult or easy and so forth. And that will give us the foundation to then go into the second verse and so on. So happy experimenting. That's kind of the first verse in the next text. And this text is very commonly used and practiced and taught. And it will give us much more radical practices later on, but this one is already a bit of a challenge. So let's play with it and see how it feels, and we'll check in next time. So thank you for joining. It's been lovely to see all of you, including those joining from Portugal. Big hello. And yeah, thank you for your patience, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.